Welcome everyone. This is the first webinar for the Center for Academic and Faculty Excellence. My name is Shelby Lamar, pronouns they, them, and I'm the Associate Director here. Today we have the Director for the Queer Resource Center that serves all 7 Cs, going to present to us on faculty and treating LGBTQ plus students with equity. So Bree started with the QRC, did you say about a year ago?
So I joined in December last year. Yeah.
December. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Great. So I will let them take over, and I will also co-host and watch the chat if anyone has any questions that I can help with. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Shelby. Thanks y'all for being here. I appreciate it. I'm Bree Sérráno. I use he, they pronouns. I'm the Assistant Dean and Director of the Queer Resource Center that serves all the Claremont colleges. I am also a PhD candidate and hoping to finish my PhD in spring, Colorado State University. My research focuses on trans staff of color who have reported discrimination in higher ed and their experiences. It's a narrative inquiry study. And I've taught 4.5 years at Cal Poly Pomona in ethnic and women's studies. So I'm very familiar with the classroom and it can be a lot. So we're here to learn together today. Thank you for having me. And just to let you know, we're using a Mentimeter today. So if you should see on your screen, menti.com, if you go to that on your phone or on your computer that you're on, if you're on one, and enter in the code 5871 6806, and you should be able to join. So that way you can interact with the presentation as I go through. I typically have Farrellyn here supporting me with this IT part of it, who's the Assistant Director of the QRC, but she's not here today in this session. So there should be a heart icon, a question icon, a thumbs up, a thumbs down, and a little comment box. So if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to click one of those, drop your question in the comment box, and we're going to have some open-ended questions for you to engage with today. So that way it's more participatory than just listening to me talk, because I could go on and on. Okay, cool. Well, thank you. All right. So we are professionally staffed at the Queer Resource Center. So myself, and as I mentioned, Farrellyn, she's a she, they pronouns. She's the Assistant Director of the Queer Resource Center. We're an office that supports all 7 Claremont colleges, as I mentioned. And so that's really important to know because while I'm employed at Pomona, we serve all 7. We engage with all 7 in various ways around policy, support, how to support LGBTQ students. As a note, I don't have it on the slide, but I am a confidential resource for the 7 Cs. Okay, so if any students want to share anything in particular that may encroach into Title IX, domestic violence, harassment, etc., sexual violence, please refer them my way if you would like. I don't have a reporting requirement, but I am not legally confidential. I am institutionally confidential. So if I was subpoenaed, then there is a chance that I would have to testify. But please share that with students, as well as the other opportunities for graduate students to seek support. So really just for our discussion today, please stay open as you can. Be present as you can. I know it's distracting to be on a computer as you're listening or watching a presentation. It's real. And authentically share as you feel comfortable. Like I said, there are some open-ended questions that you could engage with. Those are completely anonymous. I won't know who submitted them, but I want this to be an opportunity for learning and growth. And I would like you to, ask questions that you're pondering here in this session. And then learning leaves, but identity stays. So if somebody shares something really vulnerable or shares something that, is personal to them, then just be mindful that, not sharing their identity, but just sharing what you learned from today. Okay. So the Queer Resource Center, we're located at the Pomona College physical campus space. We're on the north side off of 6th Street, right across the street from Claremont McKenna College, where our residence halls meet. And so it's called Walton Commons. if you look at a campus map, you'll see us there. We offer a physical space of a lounge. It is reservable if you ever want to reserve it for one of your classes, or if you want to come in for a student program, whatever it may be. We have a full kitchen. We have 2 full restrooms. We have a full clothing closet for folks to come and peruse. If you'd like to take whatever you'd like to your heart's content. We are literally overflowing with clothes right now because of the end of last semester where a lot of people dropped off stuff. You're welcome to take what you'd like. And then we have different community engagement opportunities. So we have partnerships with the Pomona Pride Center, which is a community center located in the city of Pomona. We work in collaboration with offices throughout the consortium, as well as our connection to local nonprofits. So the Foothill AIDS Project, Planned Parenthood, Bienestar, which is the LGBT Latinx org that's in Pomona. And we connect students and faculty and staff to our other partners throughout Southern California, or even to national organizations. We also have QSafe, which is the Queer Staff and Faculty lunch program. So we don't provide lunch. We ask folks to bring their own lunch, but we meet monthly for just really to be in community. We eat outside the QRC and just hang out. We had our most recent one was yesterday, but we have it monthly on a rotating basis. So if you want to be added to that listserv, feel free to DM me on here on the Zoom, or if you want to reach out and email me, you're welcome to as well if you want to be added to that listserv. And then connect to local nonprofits, as I mentioned. And then at the end of the year, we have Lavender graduation. If you know any graduating seniors, please recommend that they put in their application for Lavender graduation. It's a first come, first served basis in terms of their tassel and their cord that we give them. We actually have the application available online now on our website. If you know any students who are graduating, whether that be in December or spring, that would be great to have them. And that usually takes place in April. So digging into some concepts of gender and sexuality, really wanting to talk about how does this show up in the classroom, right? How does this show up in the curriculum? How does this show up in the syllabi? And what are some considerations to have? So I think one place that we could start at is the gender binary. So what is the gender binary? How is it prevalent within society? And thinking about, you know, when someone's pregnant, right, or if somebody has a child, of asking, is it a boy or girl, right? There's gender reveal parties, if folks are familiar with that. Apparently they're very popular on social media. There have been some unfortunate disasters that have come from some of those. Well, we won't get into that today. It's just more about like, how does this show up? And so for those of you who are on the Mentimeter, if you could please get out your device and thinking about like, how has the gender binary impacted you? And I'm talking personally speaking, not necessarily in the classroom, unless it's part of the classroom, right? Go ahead and share in an open response of like, how has it impacted you? And I think I could give an example. So one example would be, so I was raised in a Mexican household, fairly traditional. My mom went to Catholic school, which she has her own stories about. But when, you know, when I was younger, my mom was very clear to me about the way in which I show up physically in front of people and how I had to sit. And I had to always cross my legs. I had to sit ladylike. I couldn't sit with my legs open or in any kind of more relaxed state because that wasn't presentable, right? And so that was something that I learned at a very young age of what it meant to exist as somebody assigned female and the way that I should conduct myself, right, in public or with friends or with other family. And I remember, I don't know if y'all remember this, will date me, but if y'all remember spaghetti straps, remember there had to be like a 2-finger like measurement or somebody got sent home. You know, looking back at that, I'm like, wow, that's really interesting how that was a rule, right? And what did it mean for somebody to miss a day of school because of that? Because of the way they were expressing themselves, right, and their gender. Yeah. So feel free to share as you feel comfortable doing so. So how has the gender binary impacted you? It made my relationship with my family difficult. As female, I was made to feel that I needed to know how to cook if I wanted to get married. Yes. Oh my God. My family still shames me for not knowing how to cook. It's rough. Yeah, I mean, I cook little things, but I definitely can't cook like my grandma could. Experiencing expectations and assumptions about my abilities. Yeah, because of my gender. What's the opportunities, right? How is somebody socialized in private and public spaces my entire life? Why don't you have children? Yes, I get this as well. And I also get doctors sometimes that assume I don't want kids because I'm trans, which is interesting. But I don't want kids, so they're right. um, Assumptions about my likes or dislikes. Just this weekend, I was told I might not like a film because of my gender. Wow. Wow. That's, yeah. Thank you. It challenged me to be mindful of pronouns and identity. When I taught high school last year, I mistakenly misgendered a student. I'm learning. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're here. Yes, we are all constantly learning. The gender binary made me assume a lot about what I should or should not like. Why do you use pronouns? Yeah, and we're going to talk about pronouns too. So we could couch that one for a few slides. Well, thank you all for sharing that. And I also want to provide an opportunity. What's queer? Okay, we'll get into that as well. Would anyone like to unmute and share as you feel comfortable? If not, that's fine too. I just want to allow another option for folks. Or if you'd like to elaborate on maybe what you dropped in here. Oh,
You can go ahead and share. Oh, sorry, there's hands up.
oh. Okay, cool. Tamar, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yes. I wrote about when I mistakenly misgendered a student last year when I was teaching high school. It's a high school in Claremont. I'm not currently in the Los Angeles, California area, but it got me thinking. So beyond the situation that happened, which the student was lovely and it was definitely a learning experience, but beyond that, it got me thinking about that binary and how in my life, I was a tomboy when I was a kid and certain things that were supported, certain things that weren't supported. Like in my home, that was definitely supported. Do whatever you want, play in the dirt kind of thing. But in school, it was very, as connected to what you were talking about. You have to be nice, you have to be polite, whatever. So that learning experience was more than just that learning experience, which is, it's a great thing. So,
yeah, thank you for sharing that. Eric, you want to add anything?
Sure. Yeah, I just mentioned that it's a challenge always in private and public spaces for me. I feel like people have expectations of me or my spouse's roles. They want to know very intimate details about me. I find it a real big challenge, not only in my private life, but when I step out in the public. I've also had different students ask me, for example, I'm married, if I'm in an open marriage. So oftentimes I feel that the gender binary has been a challenge for me as a mid-career doctoral student on campus. And I hope that we can talk about how people can be culturally competent to different relationships and to privacy and respect.
Yes, I appreciate that, Eric. Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm sorry you experienced that. I think that, what you're describing opens up the discourse around, this objectification, right, of people's bodies, of people's relationships, of queerness in general. And I think that, Fairland says this really well of this assumption or people's right to know private information from people, right? And having these questions, but also putting that out on people who are different than them, right? And saying like, educate me, maybe versus doing their own research. So I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you. And you know, I think you bring up some valid points. And you know, if anybody wants to dig further after this, please reach out to me. That's what I'm here for, to get more information and to learn more. And so we won't cover every single thing today, but I think these are really great points here. So thank you for bringing that up. Emily?
Hi, everyone. So I work at a high school, and I've been the GSA sponsor for years now.
Oh,
And so I've had to really educate myself to best support my students, and then also to challenge my colleagues to be more inclusive, fight for an all gender restroom and things like that. And so I've been really involved as an ally in the LGBTQ community in the East Side in Boyle Heights. But a few years back, my son came out and he's been transitioning. And so it's so interesting for me because as an educator, it's a very different hat than when you're a parent. And I found myself to give resources to myself, like, oh my goodness, now I'm going to join that parent support group. But I think, it's just made me so mindful of even like myself. I consider myself a very strong ally. Like one of the things that my son said when he first came out to me was like, oh, part of my birth story, you always say how much you wanted a girl. And here I was thinking, I'm like this radical feminist, like ally. And I didn't realize like things like that I took for granted, of things that I would say that was ultimately hurting him, and I think now I'm even like going through a more deeper exploration. And similar to you, I grew up in a very traditional Latinx family. We're Guatemalan, Catholic, right? And I definitely want to protect him. And luckily my family's been very supportive. It's new for all of us, but it's just like, I think I'm now so much like hyper aware now of like the gender binary. First because of the work that I've done with students, but now as a mother, I'm like, oh, I want to protect my son and I want him to have a great experience. But it's definitely like you start seeing all of the things that are coming up and like how it could potentially impact him and his peers. And so I think like that's made me become more mindful of the words I use, the language. And like I really didn't even realize that I included that gender piece in his birth story, and now I'm like, oh man, like I didn't even think that would be something that could hurt someone.
No, thank you for sharing that. And I think we don't know, right? And I think that sounds similar to my mom. She had me do things that I was like, it doesn't feel good for me. I used to do tap dance and ballet. You can imagine that. She used to make her little outfits and I hated it. And I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense now. But here we are, right? And so thank you for sharing, and thank you for, supporting your son. Well, thanks, y'all. So yeah, we were gonna get to queer pronouns. Queer I can talk about right now. Pronouns we'll get to. So queer, I think, oh, is that like if people are asking you what is queer or why you use pronouns? I think those could be examples of it, but I could mention it anyway. Because sometimes I think people are like, oh, isn't that a derogatory term? I think if somebody's using it in a derogatory way, that's really harmful. And at the same time, there are people who have reclaimed the term to, feel more empowered and describing somebody who may not be exclusively straight, right? Or exclusively heterosexual, I should say. So yeah. So the gender binary, right? We talked about that, of interconnected components, repression related to sexism, prejudice, discrimination against trans and non-binary people. And so sexism is really this concept that cisgender people or people who aren't trans have a more prioritized position, or the default, right? Kind of what we were talking about, of assuming somebody's lived experience versus somebody who's trans. More than the belief of only two genders, right? People are gender fluid, people are gender queer, people are non-binary, and going beyond men and women, right? Resulting in gender roles and expressions and the opposition between men and women, and subordination of non-binary and gender non-conforming folks. And so therefore, right, some people believe that gender is very specific and fixed and salient, and it's in this box, right? And if you don't fit into this box, then there's something wrong. And the implied expectation of straightness, which is heterosexuality and monogamy, and assuming that everyone's monogamous. So that's all informed by the gender binary. So transgender, so describes somebody whose gender is different from what is typically associated with their sex assigned at birth. So sex assigned at birth is whatever's on his birth certificate. And trans at the Latin root means going beyond more than one or multiple. Cisgender is same. Cis as the Latin root means same, so same gender. It's describing an individual whose gender is the same as the gender that's typically associated with somebody that's assigned at birth. Trans feminine, trans masculine, you may hear also. So somebody who expresses themselves, who's trans or non-binary or gender non-conforming, as more feminine or masculine. So like I describe myself as trans masculine non-binary. I don't identify as a man at all. And so, you know, somebody's gender expression could have to do with that, right? In the way they express themselves, or it may not, and that's okay. And I think all of this is relative, right? Like my sister, I think she's feminine. She does not think she's feminine. I'm like, okay, cool, but we both have different definitions of femininity, right? And so that's all relative and could be fluid at any point. Any questions so far as I'm moving along? Just want to pause for a second to see. So, you know, when thinking about the classroom, the syllabi, I think, you know, discourse that happens, if there's trans folks in your classroom or a colleague of yours, you know, there may not be any kind of stereotypical indicators that somebody's trans or non-binary. There are some people who don't undergo any type of physical transition. There's people who do not do surgery or hormone replacement therapy. They may socially transition, meaning like they may change their name, they may change their pronouns, they may change, you know, the way in which they're referred to by other people. But, you know, I think there's this concept that sometimes can still be ingrained of like, oh, what are you transitioning to, right? Like basically what's the end goal, or are you done transitioning? There is no finish line in my professional opinion, okay? There's other people you could talk to that maybe have different opinions. There's not like a finish line of like, check you're trans, right? There's no checkbox list. And so it doesn't always have to be female to male, male to female. And I think that with younger generations, right, coming into higher education, coming into grad school, that looks different than it did potentially 40 years ago, right? There are students who don't want to pass or don't agree with the concept of passing, which means like you could go through the world and be seen. For me, let's say, for instance, as a man, right? Like I don't pass and I don't want to pass unless, you know, that's something that's my goal, right? But who is that being done for, you know, is the question that comes up often in terms of like hormone replacement therapy or surgery or anything like that. And there's some people who don't change anything and they just know who they are, right? But don't have to change anything. And so it's constantly evolving. And I think even with these definitions, right, those can change as well. So pushing back against pathologizing, you know, this concept of gender dysphoria, right? Refraining from automatically diagnosing people who are trans. My research, like I said, is in discrimination against trans staff of color in higher ed. And with my lit review, there is a lot of research that does show that trans people, even when applying to a position, are automatically seen as having a mental illness and or automatically seen as somebody who's not going to show up to work because they're going to be calling in more often, because they're going to be more depressed, more anxiety, more medical appointments, et cetera. So they're not seen as an ideal candidate. And I can send you all of my lit review if you want. And so it's fascinating, right, to see that come into play, whereas people are automatically diagnosed, whether or not they're officially diagnosed. And so dysphoria is in the DSM-5. Gender dysphoria is a condition that's not only limited to trans people though, right? And so I hear about people talking about gender affirming surgeries or procedures, right? That happens with cis people as well. So I think about like lip fillers, or I mean, I've gotten Botox. I'm good with sharing that. Or breast augmentation, right? Or BBLs, whatever else there could be, right? Or people, or even makeup, you know, or even having a certain type of hairstyle could be really affirming for somebody and their womanhood, right? My mom loves that stuff and that makes her feel good, right? So thinking about, there's definitely ways in which a lot of people seek out affirmation physically for them to feel good about themselves and in their body. And so, there's a lot of images of beauty standards. And I recently heard a podcast that was talking about Ozempic and like all these weight loss drugs and how that's kind of bringing back the conversation about like fat shaming or fat phobia, So like cisgender people, not all trans people live with dysphoria, and people could be completely good with where they're at physically. So recommended practice and tips for engaging, I want us to think about pronouns. So pronouns are a substitute for nouns that somebody uses to refer to another person, or in third person if they're talking about themselves. So these are some of the more common ones. I think she, he, they are more common that I've seen at the colleges. There are some students that use Z and A. There's a lot of other neo-pronouns is what they're called that folks use. And so this is not a comprehensive list. This is something that, if folks are getting used to practicing somebody's pronouns, that's always helpful. If you want to do that on inanimate objects, other people, maybe in conversation, if I'm like, hey, Eric, can we practice they pronouns right now? During this conversation, let's refer to whoever it may be, right? Just with these pronouns, just to make sure that I don't accidentally misgender them. And if that happens, right, what's really, really important is not to make it about yourself. It's about really just acknowledging, apologizing, and moving on. It doesn't have to be a whole scene at all. I had an old supervisor years ago who she would misgender me still. And one time she called me to apologize and started crying and saying how she was not a bad person. And I was like, this is a lot. Because then it comes about that person, right? It doesn't become about the person who's impacted. So strongly recommend practicing. There's also a website that Farrellyn shared with me. I believe it's called practicepronouns.com. Let's see. Oh, practicewithpronouns.com. Yeah, so you could even do that. I'll drop it in the chat. If you know anybody who's like, hey, maybe this would be a good option for you to practice, there's that website where they can practice using that in different sentences. So thinking about, how does it show up for your classroom? It could be for your department meetings, whatever it may be. So thinking about, right, what language is used on the syllabus, right, or the syllabi that you have? How can you create a safe space or a more comfortable space for students to be their whole authentic selves? Thinking about curriculum, right? Who are the researchers or authors that are on the syllabi, right? Who's creating this knowledge or informing the knowledge that's happening in the classroom, or topics that are being discussed, right, in the curriculum? How are current events happening that are impacting students? Even locally, folks are familiar with Chino Hills School District, Orange School District, and now, God, what was the most recent one? There was another local one in LA County that's also moving forward with basically outing trans students to their parents. So what the directive is that any school official will have to, Clovis, it's up north, Clovis, Unified School District, that if any child or, student shares, I'm questioning or I'm using a different name or different pronouns, they're required to inform the parents, which could create a very discomforting environment depending on, right, the parent and how they receive that information. And so it's quite concerning that that's moving forward. At the same time, the state of California Attorney General is moving forward with lawsuits for some of these school districts. So, it is a local issue as well. It's not just nationally with a lot of anti-trans legislation. But I'm noticing that here at the Claremonts, there have been students who have come from out of state because it is California, because they can receive gender affirming care. So there may be an increase in your classrooms or with students that you serve who are seeking out that support. I will say, so SHIP, I'm not sure if CGU students get SHIP or KGI students do, but the student health plan does cover gender affirmation, surgery, and hormones. So I would strongly recommend you share that with students if they have questions. I think for other plans, I know Kaiser does as well if they have Kaiser, but some people will just have that, opportunity here and may not when they go back home, or even to other countries that they live in, right? Because there are many countries who have anti-LGBTQ laws as well, where maybe here is the place where they feel most comfortable. So, being conscious of current events, right? And I know it's not an exciting conversation to have when things happen. I think that students appreciate in the classroom when at least current events are being acknowledged, right? Like, hey, I'm aware this is happening. Let's do our best to stay focused today. Or does anyone want to share any space to talk about this? Something just happened, right? Affecting LGBTQ folks, Black folks, immigrant communities, right? And expectations and guidance for course conduct. I think for me as a faculty member, it was really essential for me to say at the beginning, these are my expectations of class conduct, right? I will not tolerate XYZ, right? And at the same time, I know it can be hard because the students are with you for 16 weeks. So that's real. I'll share an example. So I had a student who was in my class. It was a diverse genders and sexualities course. He took it because it was an elective, and it also completed one of his GE requirements. And we were talking about gender and sexuality and indigenous populations and colonialism and all of that. And he started to quote the Bible. And there were queer students in the class as well. And me as the faculty member, right, I set the tone. And so I said, tell me more about that. Because we were talking about, identity being fluid, and he strongly believed that people were born straight and shared that. And so implying, right, that it's a choice. And I said, thank you, whatever, I know what his name is now, but Albert, let's say, for sharing that. I hope that you continue to stay in class and to stay engaged, because I think that this class will greatly inform where these concepts come from, especially related to colonialism and indigeneity. And I think it's a tender line to walk, right? When there's students who are queer and trans being impacted by comments, and at the same time knowing that student may shut down and not learn the rest of the semester. And this was like week 2. So at the end of the course, he had a lot of growth and understanding, and he even wanted to stay in contact with me, and his perspective was much more open-minded at the end of class. And I know that that can be difficult. So just keeping in mind power dynamics, right, and facilitation of discussions, and thinking about, if this comes up, how am I going to respond to this? Because it's really important, because I think sometimes if it's completely ignored, then that can be even worse, right? Because then it'll be like, why didn't the faculty address this, So thinking about that, right, I want you to respond to this, of how does gendered language or concepts around gender or LGBTQ discussions show up in your classroom? If you can give some examples of maybe how that's shown up for you, or how you anticipated showing up for you. I'm thinking here. Hormones, gender affirming care. Where can we find resources for students for once they graduate or move away, so they don't lose access to their care meds? Yeah, I think that's a big one. So I'll get to this question, and then if you want to keep submitting for this question about how it shows up in your syllabus or your classroom. So I think depending on if they have insurance or not, right? If they don't, I know Planned Parenthood, depending on the location, does offer HRT. The LA LGBT Center also does prescribe it. There may be, depending on where they're physically at, a local LGBT center who does it, or nonprofit like Planned Parenthood. I would also say there have been times where, for example, we've had students who they got a 3-month supply right before summer started. So that way they could have it throughout the summer and not have to worry about it. That's an option. Yeah, I would just say, certain states, as we may or may not know, are limiting this access or getting rid of it altogether, and not just for children. I think a lot of the focus has been on kids, but there are some states who ban it for people up to the age of 26. And in the state of Florida, there's been a lot of stories about folks being dropped altogether from their primary care provider because they don't want to be assumed to be prescribing things that they legally shouldn't in Florida anymore, even though the person is trans and they're not seeking that kind of care. Just altogether, it's becoming really complicated. And at times there have been folks who resort to hormones on the on markets that are not overseen by a doctor, right? And that could be really dangerous as well. Unfortunately, I had a student pass away that way at Penn State when I was there for my master's, and she was just getting estrogen, but she didn't have access to it otherwise. So how does gendered language or concepts show up in your classroom? I've had students with pronouns that were not respected by other students. Okay. It hasn't. I teach STEM courses and I haven't been able to add these concepts I would like to, but don't know how. Okay. And if you want, we could talk about that either now, or if you want to set up a meeting with me, feel free to email me. We could talk about how that could be integrated. Supporting staff, students to be inclusive of pronouns and helping students change their student records to include their preferred name and gender. Unfortunately, LAUSD requires parental permission. Oh, that's interesting. Wow. Students who do not feel comfortable working with male presenting students due to past microaggressions in their class. Yes, that makes sense if that trickles in. Thank you for sharing that. Wow, that's so interesting about LAUSD. I didn't know that. Now, is that to use the name and pronouns in the classroom, or
No,
just
I
changing their
mean,
records?
We encourage our staff to ask, students what they prefer, but it makes it really hard because online when they're taking attendance, it will only show the birth certificate name. And if you submit a form to change it, the parent has to sign off. And it's upsetting because if you think about all the records, like a diploma or the yearbook, it's all connected to their online record system. And they don't want a diploma with a name that's not theirs, but if they're not open or accepted by their parents, it's just something that we constantly have to, or if there's a sub and they print out the roster, it's going to have the wrong name. Yeah. So we've been trying to push back on that because I think the Bay is kind of more advanced with letting students submit that form on their own. But LUSD says that parents have rights and they're protected. And so it's something that we constantly have to figure out with students.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry to hear that's happening.
Yeah.
Because, depending on the parent, right? Yeah. Okay. Shelby, did you want to add anything? I thought I saw you unmute, but if not, that's fine.
Oh, no, I was just going to also be surprised. And yeah, I didn't realize that at all. I know a lot of that is happening in some of the southern states as well, but it's disappointing to hear that it's kind of leaking into California, which I like to think is a more protected state for queer people, which it is comparatively. It is more protected, but yeah, it just makes me conscious that we need to keep up the fight for these things to make sure that everyone has a safe learning environment. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. These babies. I just think of the babies, the trans babies. I'm like, oh, my heart. Okay. Students. Anyone want to add on to this at all?
I do want to share that I know STEM at a university level is completely different. But, like I said, I try to promote inclusive curriculum and stuff. And so something that we've done with our computer science teachers or math teachers is look at queer mathematicians and bringing that into the classroom, looking at, Alan Turing, the grandfather of computer science and, kind of how you can kind of bring in maybe the theorists and the mathematicians and scientists. And then in biology, we've talked a little bit about gender and like biological sex, or like even how that's problematic. So that's how we've kind of tried to tackle some of that, because a lot of times it gets like, oh no, only English and history can like, or the humanities can discuss this, and we're like, nope, like it's also happening in STEM. So that's how we've done it at the high school level. I mean, I know at the university level it might be a little bit more different.
Yeah, and there's some faculty here too. There's one that so I'm on the World AIDS Day Committee, and then we recently invited a faculty to present if he's available. His research, I don't know if it's STEM specific. I know that it's related to HIV and AIDS. So I don't know if there's anything around like epidemiology, and the pervasiveness of, um, thinking about disease in certain communities, also being a stereotype, right? And thinking about the Red Cross even. Sorry, I'm just going off tangent. I'm gonna keep going. But yeah, I'm thinking about who are the researchers, right? In epidemiology. There's some, or even like one of my colleagues she's at Caltech, her dissertation was looking at the experiences of STEM students who are Black women. And so even if there's research like that of like, well, may not be necessarily like Bio 101 or something, but looking at the field of study itself and what challenges does it present around like anti-Blackness or homophobia or transphobia, etc. But those are some thoughts. But if you want to talk more individually, feel free to email me. So just some tips for engaging. I know we're getting a little low on time, and I want to have time for Q&A if there's any. So please, you're welcome to put your pronouns on your syllabi. I think that always is a great signal for students to see that on there. Like, oh, this person's familiar with this concept, right? Like I said before, expectations around classroom conduct and what's acceptable, or, if XYZ occurs, this is how we'll handle it. Resources. So if there's any nearby all gender restrooms to where your physical classroom space is located, that would be great to access. Or similarly, if there's any nursing rooms for folks if they have kids and they need to pump or anything like that, that would be helpful to know. Please put the Queer Resource Center on your syllabi if you would like, and other resource centers that students could benefit from, because sometimes, and I think, there's a lot of students who work full-time, right? Who come to CGU for class in the evening, whatever it may be, and may not be familiar with everything that we have to offer at the colleges. And so that would be a good way to share the information on there. Using inclusive language and mindfulness of name and pronouns for classroom use. I think something that has come up, when I was teaching, and even now, is some students like to use certain names and pronouns in only certain spaces. So they may say, please use this name and these pronouns for me in the classroom, please don't use it in public, right? Or vice versa, right? And so thinking about that use, and something that I've done in the past to not necessarily for students to share their pronouns, the first day of class, introducing themselves, is giving them little contact cards of like, hey, right, I mean, granted, do people print things anymore? But whatever, putting their name, their pronouns to use in class, right, name to use in class, because it may not align with the roster, or they may not want it to be everywhere where the updated name would show, right? So that's an option as well. Or even asking them, if you notice, I think somebody had mentioned earlier in the chat, if a student's being misgendered by their other students, I would check in with the student and say, hey, I've noticed this happening. When this happens, do you want me to address it in the moment? Do you want me to take those students aside? Do you want me to not say anything? Because I think sometimes it's important to have them be empowered to make their own decisions around how that plays out. And I think that coming to the rescue can feel really good and could be valid. And the student might be like, oh, I actually didn't want you to do that for me, so checking in with them. Like I said, querying trans researchers, querying the syllabi, right, authors, what content is being discussed, remembering the layers of intersectionality, right, multiple identities that folks experience, and micro and macro aggressions that could come about in the classroom, or with content. And thinking about the current climate nationally and internationally. And I think especially with the election coming up next year. So yeah, it's happening. So introductions. So if you're meeting with folks or students, colleagues in meetings, you can make it a practice to introduce yourself by sharing your name and your pronouns. Like I said, you could use cards at the beginning of the semester for students to fill out with what name and pronouns they would want to use in the classroom. And then being mindful of confidential resources. So the Queer Resource Center, the Empower Center, which is located at Scripps, but serves all 7. We are confidential resources. We are not legally confidential, although the chaplains and MCAPs, and I know right now that's 5C serving, but the chaplains are also confidential, but they're legally confidential. Whereas MCAPs is also legally confidential. I know they're not currently seeing CGU students right now. And then Destiny in the CARES office at Pomona. While she's at Pomona, she could still serve as a resource if folks need support in any kind of way as well. She supports survivors. So just to wrap us up, so think about, what are your action items that you want to take away from the session or implement perhaps in your classroom or in your meetings, whatever it may be, or work with students. Feel free to put some in there. What would you like this? It's always fun. So go ahead and drop them in these last couple minutes. Well, cards at the start of the class. Yeah. Yes, yes. Or even if you teach on Zoom, like I think Zoom now, the most updated one has the updates for pronouns on there. Trans content, authors, educators, and curriculum, great. It's all about resources. Mentioning cards with students in the class, great. Thank you. Sessions for instruction, students in class. So now, it's really just any Q&A. Any questions folks have that they would like to ask and get clarification on, or anything that's come up for you where you're like, I'm not sure what I do in this circumstance. Yeah, more.
We touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering, in the more impromptu situations in a class, how to frame it to allow for the subjectivity of a trans student's, like what you had pointed to in a moment ago of like, some students will not want that to be front and center in the class, some do, and there are ways to build that in, but there are also situations where it's like, it's happening and like, what do I do kind of thing.
Yeah. I appreciate that. So I would say definitely start off with the cards, right? I would say to check in with those students individually, to say, hey, I noticed this, I want to be affirming, and would you mind if I share this with the rest of the class? Or if you would like to just say, don't use this outside of this space, right? Just to reiterate that. And the student may want you to share, the student may want to share themselves, just to serve as a reminder, because I think that, students might see each other in the local community, right? And we don't want there to be any accidental, right, outing that takes place. Yeah. Yeah, Shelby.
So one of the things I did, especially as when I was first teaching, was as I was driving to the various places I was teaching, I would do example like situations in my head. Just come up with a situation that I thought, if this happens, what would I do? And most of those never happened, but I did have a few happen, and then I didn't have to think deeply about what I was going to do. I was able to just be like, oh, I've thought of this before. I was able to do it. And so I know everyone probably isn't commuting and stuff like that, but if you're ever bored and you just want to think like, what, I wonder what would happen if this happened in class. What would be the best way to react? It's also great if you're going to go do interviews as well, if they come up with situational questions. But that was just something that especially helped me as I was first teaching.
Well, thank you, Shelby. That is helpful. Yeah. So you kind of have a toolkit to go to.
What would you answer is the utmost concern for support and allyship for trans and non-binary students? Like, what's the thing or the top 3 things?
This might sound really basic. I mean, I think just acknowledging their existence, and not having that be up for debate, right? Somebody's humanity, right? And I think that happens, right? Whether or not it's intended. And I think, like, for example, there's a student here who only uses he, him pronouns. And for him, it's incredibly important still to not even use they, because that's not validating. And that, I think, has really resonated with me in being mindful of that and conscious. And I know it's conscious work. I think other things are, definitely, I think acknowledging and recognizing when something happens is really important. Because I think that when things happen, nationally or locally, whatever it may be, if it had an impact on folks, I think it's difficult in moving on with the status quo of, like, you know what I mean? It's so important, I think, to provide space, because I think that creates more of a human-centered, right, environment for students. While that may take time, and there have been times in my classes that has taken 20 minutes, right? And I know that 20 minutes is precious, and I know that it's a once-a-week class, or only, however often. And I know that meant so much for the students to just have that space for me to acknowledge that they're going through something, right? Yeah. And I think, I don't know what the third thing would be. I think just being mindful and connected to resources is really important, because it's really nice to give a warm handoff instead of saying, oh, just figure it out, right? Or just Google. I think it's nice to, I'm not saying you do that, right? I'm saying that because some people aren't the best at warm handoffs, so being like, hey, you know what? Like, have you talked to Bree, or have you talked to whoever, right? I think that feels really, that feels very different than, like, here's the QRC's email them, like I met Bree through this webinar, right? And if any of y'all, and I know some people had to go, but if any of y'all ever come by a circumstance of, like, hey, this is happening in my class, I kind of want to get a second opinion on this. What do you think? How did I handle this? Or this has XYZ has come up, right? Like, I'm not sure how to address it, then I'm always here to troubleshoot. Good question.
All right. Well, I know that people probably have to run as it comes right up against 1 o'clock. But thank you, Bree, for your presentation and answering all of our questions. Really appreciate it. And thank you for coming to speak specifically to CGU people.
This is fun. Hopefully we could do it again in the spring.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. That sounds great. Thank you. Thank you, Tamar, for your questions, and everyone who came.
Yeah.
And come to our next webinar.
Thanks, y'all. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shelby.
Thanks.